Assalamualaikum pemirsa yang dirahmati Allah. Kembali lagi ke channel Hidayah Surga, channel yang membahas tentang perkembangan Islam di dunia. Sebelum melanjutkan video ini, silakan tombol subscribe dan tekan tanda loncengnya supaya tidak ketinggalan kisah cerita selanjutnya. Semoga Allah selalu melimpahkan rahmat dan hidayahnya kepada kita semua. Barokallah, amin.
I'm an American. I'm a convert to Islam. Grew up in America, born in America, grew up in America, and daughter of a Christian pastor of the Presbyterian Church. A typical childhood, a typical North American childhood, white middle class childhood. Typical American white middle class upbringing. My family has been in the United States for well over 400 years. My mother's family came over on the Mayflower and were actually fighters in the American Revolution to kick out the British. My father was a preacher. He was a Presbyterian and spent my childhood growing up in many different homes for the preachers we called manses. And we moved around a lot. My father and my grandmother, my father's mother, was one of the pioneers of the American feminist movement. She wrote a best-selling book in 1952 called I'm Tired of Grandma. So these are the people, my father and my grandmother, who had the biggest effect on me and my family. My grandmother and all of her family are Canadian, or she was Canadian before she moved down and immigrated to the United States. So these people, my grandmother and my father, were also involved in the civil rights movement. Were involved in interfaith, and I grew up with a deep connection to the church. And when I discovered Islam, I was not looking for another religion. I was happy as a member of the church. I was a churchgoer. I was in the choir. And I went through the whole Presbyterian process of becoming a member of the church, which is quite involved. So when I discovered Islam, was a student at Temple University. And I was a communications major, but I was also taking courses in political science and history. And I realized very soon that these courses were missing a lot of information about Islam. And you don't have to be a Muslim to appreciate the fact that Islam has a big role to play in the history and the politics of the Middle East. So I wanted to understand more. I'm a book addict. I'm a normal curiosity, and wanted to expand my understanding. So I wanted to learn more about Islam and to understand more the kind of effect that it had or has. And don't forget that this was a time in 1977 before internet, before cell phones, smartphones, before a lot of the technology that we take for granted nowadays. So when you wanted to find out information, you had to have a lot of common sense. You had to go to the library and talk to professors and that sort of thing. So really, logically, whenever you want to learn more about a religion, you go read the holy book for that religion. And everyone knows that the Quran is the book of Islam, the holy book of Islam. So I went to the library And it was important for me. I was a member of the church. I was a practicing Christian. It was important for me not to get a book that was biased. That it was, a translation that was written by a Muslim with a Muslim bias. So I looked specifically for a translation of the Quran that was written by a non-Muslim. And I found one, very old. And I borrowed it, and it was a pretty horrible experience. It took me a long time to slog through the reading of that translation. And I remember just stubbornly wanting to get through it, and at the end wondering why anybody would ever be a Muslim. And very disappointed, I took the translation of the Quran back to the university library. In 1977, when you returned the book, maybe some of our older viewers may remember that you had the little card, and I returned the Quran, and the receptionist looked at it, and she said, "Oh, the Quran, how did you like it?" And I said, "It's a terrible book. I don't know why anybody would be a Muslim." And she looked at it again, and she said, "Do you know who this is written by?" And I said, "No." And she said, "This translation was written by a missionary, an Anglican priest, whose life mission, he said it was to keep people from understanding Islam because it was such a horrible religion." And so he wrote the translation of the Quran with the intent and purpose of distorting that message. And I said, "Wow." And before I could say anything else, she reached down underneath the desk and she said, "Here, take my translation." She had the translation of Abdullah Yusuf Ali. And it just so happened on that afternoon, on that day, that I got the only Muslim, American Muslim, employed by the university library while she was on duty at the front reception. SubhanAllah. So I borrowed her copy, and of course, reading it was a much different experience. And it really was a shock to my system, a shock to my faith, because I could not deny that there were clear elements in the Quran that were divine, that were deeply spiritual. And it really spoke to me on a very visceral level. However, I hesitated at the beginning because I thought about all the terrible things that are going on in Muslim countries and all the terrible things that Muslims are doing. But I kept coming around to the core of the message of Islam, which is the belief in one God without any partners, without any sons or daughters or mothers or anything else. Just to believe in God. And to have that direct, intimate, conscious connection to this omnipotent being, which we have in Islam, is incomparable in any other belief system I've studied. And when you take the example of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the life he led, and all of the facts that surround him and his life that you can read in all different kinds of books of seerah, well recorded. This for me is just what we say in Arabic, usul. This is going back to the foundations, going back to the core, what is really important. And that is the belief in God with that direct connection, and the belief in the prophethood of Muhammad ﷺ. Everything else is secondary. Everything else is not as important. And I kept coming back to this. I could not deny this oneness of Allah, oneness of God, this direct connection. I really liked that. I liked that idea, and it really appealed to me. And the more you read about the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the more you have to admire that individual. Alayhi afdal salatu wassalam. So I got to the point where I was even leaving my studies, and it was causing me some kind of stress, because I was at a point where I couldn't make sense of the difference between Islam and Muslims. And so I decided to become a Muslim. And I said a dua to Allah. I said a prayer to Allah. And I said, please, Allah, help me with the rest. Help me to understand, clarify it, guide me. Because at the core, the most important bit is what I believe in. And women's issues, humanitarian issues, human rights, civil rights, all the things that I was brought up to see as very, very important and core values. I found that there were very serious issues amongst Muslims themselves in the majority of Muslim countries. So I just asked Allah, I'm putting my trust in you, 100%. Help me out with the rest. And so the next dilemma for me was to figure out how to become a Muslim. Because I said no internet, very little literature out there in 1978, 1977 about how to become a Muslim. And so I sought out people that I knew were Muslims at my campus, on my campus, and they were not helpful, unfortunately, for different reasons. And I got very many masjids, very many mosques in the United States. There were very few prayer rooms, and hard to find. Unless I guess you were a Muslim, and the Muslims talk to Muslims and they tell each other things about where to find things. But if you were not a Muslim, or if you were not part of that particular ethnic community, it was very hard for you to get that information. So I found this prayer room, and I went there, and I found a man sitting on the floor with his back turned to me, and he seemed to be chanting, singing, whatever, obviously reciting the Quran out loud, but in a low voice. It was like in the middle of the afternoon. I don't remember what time it was, but I said, here's an opportunity to find out how to become a Muslim. There's a Muslim. And I knew enough to take my shoes off, so I took my shoes off at the door, and I walked across and I tapped him on the shoulder, and I said, Assalamu alaikum, can you help me? And he turned to me with such a look of horror and disgust, and didn't even return my greeting, that I was a bit taken aback. But I had reached the point of frustration, and I'd reached the point of being so fed up that I figured I'm just going to steel my nerves and give it one more shot. And if this doesn't work, then God, you're just going to have to give me another chance to find out how to do this. And it wasn't an easy thing to do either. I mean, I remember the first time somebody asked me why I was dressed the way I was, and I said I was a Muslim. I actually trembled. The idea of becoming a Muslim for me was no small thing. And so, in spite of his bad reaction, I decided to make one more try. And I tapped on his shoulder again and said, I'm really sorry for bothering you. If you just tell me how to become a Muslim, I'll leave you alone. And his whole face kind of changed. It's like he took one mask off and put on another. And he said to me, I want you to accept my apology for the way I behaved. And he said, come with me to the library and I will explain everything. This man was a PhD candidate in comparative religion. And he sat with me in the library for maybe 2 hours, writing everything down in Arabic, helping me to say the Shahada, writing down Surah Al-Fatiha and another surah, because there wasn't any pre-published about how to pray, at least that I had access to. And he wrote everything down, and he made me repeat it after him. And then he basically said, good luck.
Hidayah surga adalah hadiah ilahi yang mengubah hati kita, mengukir kebaikan dalam tindakan kita, dan memberi kita pandangan akan keindahan yang tak terbayangkan di surganya, kebahagiaan yang abadi. Sekian, terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.